good to see everybody, and I think I'd like to thank in particular, we've got a representative from Shell here today, and so I'd like to thank her for taking time out to come here and hear our presentations. We've heard from the other studies which looked at the public sector and private sector providers of natural resources. The work that we're going to report on covers some of the issues that emerged out of their work. But the focus of our study was on heavy industry. We were working with Shell and with Volvo Trucks. These are very different kinds of organisations. They're some of the largest transnational corporations in the world. They operate globally. And of course, they're particularly interesting because climate change is a global phenomenon. They're also highly significant as well because, a substantial proportion of carbon emissions emerge from oil and gas extraction and the products of that in forms of transport, heating, and so on and so forth. So it's of particular interest to this project. I think what differentiates our work slightly from some of the previous works is that we're interested in the individual and the structural in context. The organisation does not stop, as we said, at the factory gates. There is a value chain, and workers go from work to home, and so on and so forth. The horizontal and the vertical, as we call it, interact. The methodologies that we use, which we just cover very, very briefly, we carried out a number of life history interviews, in-depth interviews, document analysis, a questionnaire survey, which we did in Volvo, and then observation studies. And what we're going to do in the presentation is just to include a few quotes from the people that we interviewed, because it puts flesh on the bones of some of the things that we're talking about. Okay, so the starting point is, the first question that we were interested in is what happens when workers cross borders? We use the term border crossing as opposed to spillover. There's a long discussion that we're more than happy to have about that, but we're really talking about border crossing because we think that work and home offer and prescribe different guiding principles for action. The workplace is the place which is dominated by the goals of, for example, of profitability or cost-effective service provision. One typically finds there a top-down management structure or management models, whereas the home has quite different kinds of goals, different sort of objectives. It's about care, love. It can also be about, in terms of management, it's sort of participatory decision making, well, hopefully in most houses. And we've got, with any luck, some quotes here. So as one person said, let's be real, we're here to make money. We're not here to make the world such a better place. Whereas someone else talks about, you don't want the company to fully start determining your home life as well. And that kind of sentiment is reflected in some of the findings that we got as well. So work and home are very different places. They are subject to different norms, identities, and values differ in both those spaces. So what happens when workers cross borders? The first thing to say is we found very few examples of what we would call border crossing, which I think tallies with a lot of the results in the other studies. Pie diagram there, it came from the survey done in Volvo, where we asked the question, are there actions you do at home that you could do at work, and vice versa? And something like 3/4 of the people that we interviewed said no. Where we did find border crossing, it was much more likely to take place from work to home rather than home to work. And we'll talk about the reasons for that a little later on. So here's some examples of that. You know, one person said, I've taught my wife how to recycle because I learned it at work. And whereas another one said, so at work, okay, if I have whatever, be it paper, be it cans, I recycle. But when I go home, I just put everything in one and that's it. Yes, sorry, I know. This raises an interesting issue. It raises the issue of compensation, because one of the things that people do in different places, in the other place, is they do precisely the opposite of what they do at work, or the opposite of what they do at home. There can be all sorts of reasons for this. We found, for example, that some workers would take their family away on lots of short break holidays because they were away. The people that were working on the oil rigs, because they were away for long periods of time, they felt they had to compensate, and so they would keep taking them away on high carbon emitting holidays. Other people never flew because they flew a lot for work, so when they were at home they would just drive everywhere. All of these things have quite interesting carbon consequences. I think it's important to say it's not the border crossing that leads to compensation, but rather compensation is the border crossing practice. When one wants to create strong borders between home and work. Another thing that we found was that there was often resentment as well. So hopefully it's a lovely quote here. So I'll go home and I'll walk in the door and there might be a load of shoes, and so I'll pick them up and put them on the shoe rack. And clearly then his spouse says, oh no, you're home again. We don't bother with that when you're not here. You know, there is often resentment. Partners often resent the imposition of work practices, which is seen as a symbol of an unshared lifestyle in many ways, an unshared lifestyle that is brought into the home and sits to remind the partner of absence and perhaps increasing remoteness geographically, psychologically and socially. Because, and here's another example, where the person says, I actually feel uncomfortable if someone stands on a chair to do something. I go, oh no, that's not the right tool for the job, because that's what we do offshore. It's another example of a difference, if you like. And the interesting thing about that is because certainly in Shell there's a very strong safety culture, safety becomes a very deeply ingrained habit that is part of one's identity, and thus it is more readily carried across borders. And that's why later on, when Nora's speaking, we recommend the creation of environmental cultures in organisations, to, if you like, to parallel safety cultures. This was one of the really interesting things that emerged from our study. We were obviously looking at people taking practices from home to work. What we hadn't imagined, hadn't anticipated, was that people would take management systems from work to home, talk to their partners about them, and their partners would then take them into their company. So there's some examples here whereby one person introduced their partner to a management scheme called Sigma 6, which has been developed by Motorola and General Electric, which is about improving industrial processes, which led to waste reduction and efficiencies in Shell. His wife took that to their company. The boss of that company was so impressed that he then supported her for attending training purposes and then applying the process to the business. He also talked about another management scheme called Kaizen, which is Japanese for change for the better. Again, it's about improving management processes. And in this case, it went in the reverse direction. So he said, and one of the ones I actually took back was plastic recycling. So they had a recycle route for high density plastics. This was in his wife's company. And I knew that on the Gannet, an oil rig out in the North Sea, we were using these drums and they were just going to landfill. And we had a huge cost from disposing these things to landfill. So he took that practice from another company into his company. Very interesting example there, I think, of transference. And another thing which emerged from our study, which again perhaps we hadn't anticipated so much, was what we call third spaces. Spaces which really do not function clearly as either home nor work. The factory canteen is one place. It has, if you like, almost a sort of domestic setting to it in a sense, or could be. The nursery facilities at the workplace, which is about domestic life being brought into the workplace. Mess rooms, recreation rooms on the rigs. The home, people convert spare bedrooms into studies where they work. Cars, I only mention cars because on another project I was working on, someone really hated hot desking, so he used to sit in his car in the car park and work in a car. Cafes, motorway stations, I'm sure we all work in those places. These are neither home nor work. They occupy this middle ground. The interesting thing about these third spaces, I think, is that, if you like, at one level the mobile office seems to be very highly beneficial. You've got laptops, you've got hot desking. It can be a driver and a barrier for reducing carbon emissions. It means, for example, that you can use space more efficiently and so on. But home working transfers the costs of production from the employer to the employee, heating, lighting, as well as space. In terms of environmental performance policies and standards enforced and monitored at work are not monitored and not enforced in the home. So there could be highly inefficient environmental practices going on in the home which wouldn't be allowed in the company. And likewise, carbon emissions audits tend to exclude employees' home or on-the-road carbon emissions, which is in a sense similar to outsourcing.